I'm back once again for another one of these little YouTube slash creative projects slash Muddy Point esque assignments. And uh, this time, instead of The Good Soldier, we're doing Lolita. Um, and I have to be honest, um, aside from stating the obvious that Lolita is very much an uncomfortable book, especially for you know myself. I must confess that this book feels, yes, on the theme of following unreliable narrators, but it also feels like a book that kind of harnesses the literary element of chaos, right? Um, and that's kind of what I want to explore with this particular um, video, if you will. And I think um, the most obvious place to start, right, is by looking at Humbert, right? Um, Humbert is someone who is, I think, someone who downplays just how witty and intelligent and deceptive he really is. I think um, it's no coincidence that his profession is as a professor, right? This man is someone who goes by the book in a lot of ways, and so to see him outside of the classroom and ironically not really learn a whole lot about his professional career. It speaks volumes to kind of the kind of story that we as the reader and as the audience are going to get, and what we are kind of venturing towards throughout the rest of the book, which I find interesting. But for someone that otherwise, from my point of view as a student in college, right, um, you would think is put together and has their life in order for the most part, right? Is someone who behind the scenes has very little grip of it all, right? Is someone who's really struggling to kind of hold it all together. Um, and we get a sense of this fairly early on in the book, which again speaks volumes to the kind of story that we're going to get throughout the rest of the novel, right? And I think when I talk about this element of chaos that I mentioned earlier, um, I think it comes in many different forms, right? I mean, I think for Humbert, he's at this weird crossroads at the start of the book, which again we don't get a lot of um, context of, as to how he's landed up in the situation, right? Of how he's landed up um, in this house, right? And how he's ended up taking the actions that he has, right? Um, and I think it only starts to spiral, right? It kind of comes full circle in a way. And I think one of the most unique, if not certainly most human elements in this novel is how when we as humans, despite our intelligence, despite how we may deal when we're under pressure or under extreme amounts of stress, or when we are disturbed in some way, whether that be psychological or externally, um, how we have a tendency to, when we realize that we're going down with the ship, we're bringing other folks with us, right? And it really is kind of this weird um, crux to the position, if you will, of how Humbert wants to not just ruin himself, but to ruin other people's lives as well, right? It's sort of this ethos of, if I have to suffer, then I'm gonna make sure everyone else that I am around not only knows that I am, but feels it as well in their own way, right? And it's not out of a state of maliciousness. It's not out of some sort of personal vendetta that we hold as people. I think it's merely a sense of a way of coping with whatever is troubling us, right? Of whatever is the bane of our existence in a way. And so to see this side of Humbert come out so early on in the book, I think was certainly telling for the kind of character that he is, right? It's sort of an early hint as to just how unreliable of a narrator he's going to be for a good part of the book. And I think when we are introduced to these other characters who make up the rest of the story, I can't help but feel that Humbert is surrounded by people who are just as broken and just as desolate and just as unsure of themselves and not entirely of the state of mind that they know what they're going to do with their lives, much less what they're going to do in any given moment. Um, which isn't some sort of slight on any of them, but it is to say that it feels uniquely reminiscent to real life, right? It feels uniquely similar to how we as people and how we as readers and how we as an audience can oftentimes feel that same way. Um, and I think uh, when we get into the more disturbing and certainly uncomfortable parts of the book, um, I think we start to see just how dark and um, twisted we as people can be. Um, and I don't say that as a means of generalizing or downplaying the actions Humbert takes. I'm particularly careful about using the R word. It's certainly a uncomfortable conversation for me, not just as a man, but someone who um, knows many victims of sexual assault and harassment and so on, and just general sexual trauma at the hands of folks who have very similar lives to Humbert, right? Who we as a society would feel are unsuspecting characters, but is merely a facade to what lies underneath. And I think much of the discussion that we've had in class has focused on Nabokov's critiques of the West and kind of where our morals lie as a society. And I think, as interesting as they are, um, one of the main takeaways that I took away from all of our discussions, and certainly something that still sits with me now, even after I've finished the book and whatnot, is this eerily disappointing and disheartening theme, if not a bit on the nose, of how we in Western culture have a tendency of just kind of sweeping these things under the rug, right? Um, and minimizing its impact on people. And not really wanting to do a whole lot with it because we don't want to have our fingerprints all over something that is that damaging, right? Um, I can't help but feel um, that the way Nabokov goes about all of this and the way that he crafts um, such a critique on Western culture in that particular sense um, is understandably pretty damning, right? And I think it speaks volumes to um, how we in the West were pretty critical of Nabokov's work when it first came out, right? I mean, I don't think it's a mere coincidence to say that um, Lolita had a hard time uh, being published here in the West and only barely made its way here because of that particular publishing firm in Paris. And even then, I think there was still kind of an element of risk involved with that, right? Even from their part. Um, and I also think it's not necessarily a coincidence that today, when sexual violence and acts against um, other folks done out of such harm and malice are at an all-time high within the past decade. I also don't think that's a coincidence, right? And also seeing this book speak more volumes than it did perhaps way back when it was first published, right? Um, and seeing the aftermath of how this book concludes with Humbert just losing all grip on reality, right? Of not just committing all these heinous acts and crimes, but also just losing himself and society, right? And just kind of getting lost in the plot, in a sense, right? And so, reading through the conclusion and uh, reading about the blood that's on his hands, right? And um, learning about um, the aftermath of it all, right? And how these lives are now irreplaceably damaged, right? And how they're never going to be the same because of what Humbert does. Um, Again, it speaks volumes to uh, this theme of chaos, right? Of how we as humans have a unique tendency to, when we are given the position to do so, uh, we have the power to not just make change, but to make change in the lives of people around us in ways that we otherwise couldn't conceive or think possible. And so to me, when I think of Lolita, I think of, yes, an uncomfortable conversation, but certainly a much needed one. Um, and also, I think of the psychological and sometimes mind boggling ways in which we as humans, as flawed and imperfect as we are, can sometimes lead to sheer madness and to trains and states of thought that we sometimes can't fully wrap our heads around, but is nevertheless an all too common sight for many of us. So that's my 2 cents on the book. A little bit of a shorter video, but um, yeah, hopefully that does the trick.